The Amazonian canopy, once a fortress of emerald light, had collapsed into a bruised, monochromatic world of slate gray and violent rain. The sky hadn't just opened. It had ruptured, pouring down a liquid weight that turned the solid earth into a treacherous, shifting sea of red mud. The veteran stood on the warped planks of his porch, his boots anchored to the wood as he watched the torrents carve deep, jagged scars into the soil of his ranch. The air was a suffocating soup of ozone and the sweet, heavy scent of rotting vegetation, a smell that always preceded the worst of the seasonal floods. He held a weathered steel mug, the black coffee inside long since cooled by the spray of the storm, but he didn't put it down. His eyes, a cold and disciplined gray, scanned the edge of the jungle with the same tactical calculation he had used decades ago in the shadow of the Hindu Kush. He wasn't just looking at the rain, he was evaluating the threat. The veteran said, "The forest is reclaiming its territory today. It is one of the big ones." Beside him, the dog, a powerful sable German shepherd with a coat of charcoal and silver, remained as motionless as a stone carving. The animal's hackles were slightly raised, not in aggression, but in a heightened state of sensory alertness. The dog ignored the water that lashed at his snout, his amber eyes fixed on the tree line. He was 60 kilograms of muscle and trained instinct, a partner who could hear a pin drop in a firefight and sense a change in barometric pressure before the first cloud appeared. To the veteran, the dog was more than a companion. He was the last remaining anchor to his sanity, a constant in a world that had become unrecognizable since the loss of his wife in 2021. The veteran said, "You feel it too, don't you? The silence beneath the noise of the rain." The dog let out a low, vibrant rumble from deep in his chest. His ears twitched, pivoting toward the interior of the cabin just seconds before the satellite phone on the kitchen table erupted in a shrill, digital scream. The sound was a violent intrusion, a breach of the fortress of silence the veteran had built around himself. He didn't move immediately. He let the phone ring 3 times, his mind shifting from the serenity of the porch back to the sharp, jagged edges of an emergency response. He set the mug down on the railing and walked inside, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. The veteran said, "Scott here. This had better be an actual emergency." The voice on the other end was fractured by static, thin and desperate against the roar of the wind. It was Grace Mitchell, a woman in her late 60s who owned the property 5 miles down the river. She was a woman of few words and even fewer favors, the kind of person who understood the value of isolation in the Amazon. Grace Mitchell said, "The veteran? Thank God. It's the rain. It's coming down too fast. I have tenants in the river cabin, a young couple. They were supposed to check in 3 hours ago, but the road is gone. I can't get to them, and I have a feeling, a bad one. Please, you're the only one close enough." The veteran's jaw tightened. He knew the river cabin. It was an old structure built too close to the flood zone, sitting in a hollow that turned into a bowl of mud during storms like this. It was a tactical nightmare. The veteran said, "I am not a rescue service, Grace. They should have watched the forecast." Grace Mitchell said, "Please, the girl, she's in a wheelchair. If the water rises, she's trapped. I'll pay you. I'll do anything." The veteran looked at the dog, who was already standing by the door, his eyes expectant. The mentions of the wheelchair changed the math. It wasn't just a couple of stranded tourists anymore. It was a recovery mission for a non-mobile asset. The veteran said, "Stay off the roads, Grace. I am moving now." He hung up without waiting for a reply. He moved with a practiced economic speed, grabbing a heavy waterproof tactical jacket and a recovery kit from the wall. He checked the seal on his flashlight and whistled once, a short, sharp note. The dog was at his side instantly, his body vibrating with the shift in energy. They stepped back out into the deluge, the wind trying to rip the door from the veteran's hand. He forced it shut and fought his way toward the old green off-road vehicle parked under a corrugated metal lean-to. The engine of the 4x4 roared to life, a deep, mechanical growl that fought the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The veteran shifted into low gear, the tires immediately fighting for grip in the red slurry that had replaced the road. The drive was a slow, grinding battle against the elements. The jungle seemed to lean in, the heavy branches of mahogany and ceiba trees sagging under the weight of the water, clawing at the windows of the truck. The dog sat rigid in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the headlights, his nose working the air that smelled of mud and wet fur. The veteran said, "We are going to be cutting it close. The river is already breaching the banks." They reached the access trail to the river cabin 20 minutes later. The road was gone, replaced by a rushing stream of orange water and debris. The veteran killed the engine and felt the silence of the forest rush back in, heavy and menacing. He grabbed his medical pack and the heavy flashlight, signaling the dog to dismount. The moment they stepped out, the mud rose to their knees. It was a thick, sucking trap that threatened to pull the boots right off his feet. The veteran said, "Stay close, partner. Watch for snakes in the high brush." They moved through the dense ferns, the veteran using a machete to clear the way while the dog scouted the perimeter. The sound of the river was now a deafening roar, a physical presence that shook the ground beneath them. When they finally broke through the final line of trees, they saw the cabin. It was a pathetic, shivering structure, half submerged in the rising silt. There was no light inside, no sign of life, just the rhythmic banging of a loose shutter against the wood. The veteran said, "Anyone inside? This is the neighbor. If you can hear me, speak up." The only response was the wind. The dog suddenly bolted toward the porch, his paws splashing through the rising water. He didn't bark. He let out a sharp, urgent whine and began to scratch at the door with a desperate intensity. The veteran reached the porch, his boots slipping on the slime-covered wood. He tried the handle. It was locked from the inside. He didn't waste time with a knock. He drove his shoulder into the frame, the rotted wood splintering under the force. The cabin was freezing, the air smelling of stagnant water and a faint, expensive perfume that felt entirely out of place in the mud. The beam of the flashlight cut through the gloom, reflecting off a pool of water that was already spreading across the floor. In the far corner, illuminated by the white light, he saw her. She was sitting in a high-tech, lightweight wheelchair, her blonde hair matted and wet, clinging to a face that was as pale as bone. She was dressed in a tattered white lace wedding dress, the hems soaked in red mud, looking like a ghost caught in a trap. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her body shaking with a violence that made the metal frame of the chair rattle against the floor. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror so deep it looked like catatonia. The veteran said, "Easy. I am here to get you out. Where is the man you were with?" The woman didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the rising water at her feet. Her lips were blue, her voice a fragile whisper that barely carried over the storm. The bride said, He left. Vincent said I was a burden. He said I wasn't worth the trouble of a rescue. He took the car. He took everything." The veteran felt a cold, sharp spike of rage. He looked at the wheelchair and saw the problem. The narrow wheels were wedged deep into a gap in the floorboards that had warped under the moisture. She was literally bolted to a sinking ship. He knelt in the water, his hands, scarred and calloused, moving to the wheels. The veteran said, "I am going to lift you. We are leaving the chair for now. It is too heavy for the mud." The bride said, "No, I can't walk. I can't do anything without it." The veteran looked her in the eyes, his expression hard but grounded. The veteran said, "I am not asking. The river will be inside this room in 10 minutes. You are coming with me, or you are staying with the river. Choose now." He didn't wait for her to agree. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her with a grunt of effort. She was lighter than she looked, her body feeling frail against his tactical vest. The dog stood at the door, barking once, a command for them to move. As the veteran stepped back out onto the porch, a massive mahogany limb snapped nearby, the sound like a gunshot in the dark. The veteran said, "Hold on to my neck. Do not let go, no matter what happens." The trek back to the truck was a nightmare of physical endurance. The veteran fought for every inch of ground, his muscles screaming as he carried the woman through the rising sludge. The dog moved ahead, finding the path of least resistance, his silver coat a flickering beacon in the dark. The rain lashed at them, trying to blind them, to push them down into the mud. When they finally reached the 4x4, the veteran shoved her into the passenger seat and signaled the dog to jump in behind her. He slammed the door and leaned against the hood for a second, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the red mud covering him from chest to boot. He looked at the woman in the wedding dress, shivering under the heater's glow, and then at the dog, who was licking the water from his paws. The veteran said, "We are safe for now, but the storm is just starting." He shifted into gear and began the slow crawl back to his ranch, unaware that the woman he had just pulled from the mud carried a secret that would bring a different kind of storm to his door, one made of money, power, and the kind of violence that doesn't care about the rain. The interior of the cabin was a fortress of shadows, illuminated only by the rhythmic golden pulse of the fireplace. The veteran carried the bride toward the worn, overstuffed sofa that sat as the centerpiece of the main room. He placed her down with a clinical, detached precision, ensuring her weight was distributed evenly so as not to strain her back. She collapsed into the cushions, her wet wedding dress a stark, ghostly contrast to the dark, hand-hewn mahogany of the furniture. The dog entered behind them, instantly shaking a massive cloud of rainwater from his thick silver coat, the sound of the droplets hitting the floorboards like a sudden burst of static. He didn't seek warmth for himself. Instead, he walked directly to the sofa and sat, his amber eyes fixed on the shivering woman, as if monitoring a high-value asset under guard. The veteran said, "Do not move. Your body temperature is dropping, and I need to stabilize the environment before the power fails completely." He moved through the cabin with a silent, economic grace that revealed his familiarity with every inch of the space. He added 2 heavy logs of dried ironwood to the embers, using a hand-forged bellows to coax them into a roaring flame. The heat began to radiate outward, a physical wall against the damp chill that had followed them in from the Amazon. He didn't offer comfort in words. He offered it in heat and security. He walked to a small kitchenette and began to prepare a pot of strong, bitter tea, the sound of the metal kettle on the stove being the only noise beside the relentless drumming of the rain on the corrugated roof. The bride looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the shelves made of reclaimed barn wood. There was no art, no chrome, and certainly no luxury. Instead, there were rows of worn paperbacks on diesel engine repair, rainforest botany, and classical philosophy. On the mantel sat a single framed photograph of a younger man with the same grey eyes, his arm around a woman who radiated a quiet, vibrant intelligence. The bride said, "This place, it feels like a museum. Who was she?" The veteran paused, his back to her as he poured the tea. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, before he finally turned. He didn't look at the photo. He looked at the bride, his expression unreadable. The veteran said, "She was the reason this cabin exists. She understood the silence of the forest better than anyone. Drink this. It is hot enough to burn the cold out of your throat." He handed her a heavy ceramic mug. Her hands were shaking so violently that the tea splashed over the rim, but he didn't reach out to steady her. He watched her, a deep, palpable aura of suspicion emanating from him. He saw the way her fingers clutched the mug, the way she looked at the modest interior of his home, and he felt the intrusion. She was a foreign object in his sanctuary, a piece of a world he had spent years trying to erase from his memory. He walked to a large utility closet and retrieved 2 heavy wool blankets, the color of dry earth. The veteran said, "Take off those wet clothes. Wrap yourself in these. I will be in the workshop if you need anything, but the dog will be watching. Do not try to wander. The mud outside is deep enough to swallow you whole." He turned his back, giving her a semblance of privacy. He walked out of the main room and into the small attached workshop, closing the heavy door behind him. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust, oil, and old leather. He didn't sit down. He stood by the workbench and stared at the dark wood, his mind racing through the tactical implications of the rescue. He knew Grace Mitchell wouldn't have called him unless she was desperate, but the woman in the wedding dress was a variable he hadn't accounted for. She didn't look like a typical tourist. Her dress, even mud-stained, was made of lace that cost more than his entire ranch. The veteran said to himself, "She is a lie, Everything about her is a lie. He looked at the 3 steps that separated the living area from the kitchen and the front door. To a mobile person, they were nothing. To a woman in a broken wheelchair, they were a prison. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of frustration. He didn't want a guest, and he certainly didn't want a project. But the ranger in him, the man who fixed things that were broken, couldn't leave the problem unsolved. He grabbed a tape measure and a pencil, returning to the main room. He ignored the bride, who was now wrapped in the wool blankets, her wet dress piled in a heap on the floor. He measured the height and width of the steps, his movements precise and mechanical. The bride said, "What are you doing? I told you I can't leave the sofa." The veteran said, "I am not building a cage. I am building a solution. You cannot stay in one corner for 3 days while the storm passes." He returned to the workshop and began to work. The sound of the manual saw cutting through heavy plywood was a rhythmic, meditative drone that cut through the noise of the rain. He didn't use power tools. He preferred the slow, deliberate control of the handsaw. He shaped the wood, creating a long, sturdy ramp with side rails for safety. He worked for 2 hours, his hands moving with a fluid, practiced efficiency. He thought of Kate while he worked. She had always complained about those steps, and he had promised to fix them 100 times. Now he was building a ramp for a stranger who had brought a billionaire's secret into his home. The veteran said to himself, "It is just wood. It is just a practical necessity." When the ramp was finished, he carried it into the living room. It was raw and unpainted, but it was solid. He wedged it over the steps, testing the weight with his own boots until he was satisfied that it wouldn't slip. He walked to the corner where her broken wheelchair sat, its high-tech frame twisted and useless. He knelt and used a pair of heavy pliers to straighten the primary axle, his muscles straining against the reinforced aluminum. It wasn't perfect, but the wheels would turn. He pushed the chair toward the sofa. The veteran said, "Try it. The ramp will hold. It is not pretty, but it is functional." The bride looked at the ramp and then at him. For the first time, the terror in her eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of genuine, stunned recognition. She had lived a life where people did things for her because they were paid to, or because they wanted something in return. But this man, this silent soldier, had built a bridge for her in the middle of a storm, and he hadn't even asked for her name. The bride said, "Why? Why go to this much trouble for someone you don't even know?" The veteran said, "I don't like seeing things trapped. It is a waste of energy. Now move. I have to check the perimeter before the light fails." He helped her transfer to the chair, his grip on her arms firm and impersonal. He guided her up the ramp and toward the porch, opening the door to let the cold, ozone-filled air of the Amazon hit her face. They stood there together in the fading light, the veteran, the dog and the bride, watching the wall of rain consume the world. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a shared space, a bastion against the chaos that was surely coming for them. Entendido. Foco total na versão em inglês para garantir a densidade tática e a fluidez narrativa antes de qualquer tradução. Vou utilizar o tempo de processamento para expandir as descrições sensoriais da Amazônia e a profundidade psicológica do veterano. Aqui está o Block Trace, The Language of Trust. Block Trace, The Language of Trust, English version. The third morning in the Amazonian basin brought a shift in the environment's violent frequency. The relentless, percussive drumming of the torrential rain had settled into a heavy, rhythmic drizzle that draped the forest in a translucent veil of mist. The air inside the cabin was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth, wood smoke, and the sharp, medicinal tang of the jungle, salve the veteran used on his joints. He sat at the small kitchen table, his movements slow and deliberate as he disassembled a tactical radio, his hands working with the muscle memory of a man who had performed the task 1,000 times in the dark. The light from the oil lamps flickered against the dark grain of the wood, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The veteran said, "The river is stabilizing, but the mud will remain a trap for another 48 hours. We are still isolated, but the immediate threat of a landslide has passed." The bride was seated in her chair near the window, her gaze fixed on the wall of green outside. She was wearing a faded flannel shirt that had belonged to the woman in the photograph, the heavy fabric swallowing her small frame. She looked at the ramp the veteran had built, a raw and honest piece of engineering that sat over the steps like a silent promise of autonomy. The guilt was a physical weight in her chest now, a sharp contrast to the cold calculation she had used to deceive Vincent. Here, in the silence of the rainforest, her wealth and her fake paralysis felt like a stain on the sanctuary the veteran had built. The bride said, "You talk about the forest like it's an enemy, but you chose to live here, in the heart of it. Why fight something you wanted to be part of?" The veteran didn't look up from his work. He cleaned a small copper contact with a piece of fine wool, his expression a mask of focused intensity. The veteran said, "I don't fight the forest. I respect the rules it sets. Most people come here thinking they can impose their own will on the trees. They are the ones who end up as fertilizer for the ferns. Survival isn't about winning. It's about being the last thing left standing when the sun comes up." The dog, who had been resting near the hearth, stood up and stretched his powerful charcoal and silver body. He let out a soft, inquiring sound and walked toward the bride. He didn't stop at a distance this time. He moved into her personal space, his head reaching the level of her lap. He sniffed her hand, the scent of her expensive perfume now mixed with the smell of the cabin and the rain. And then, with a heavy, trusting sigh, he reposed his large, warm head directly onto her knees. His amber eyes looked up at her, devoid of judgment, offering a pure and uncomplicated form of grace. The bride's breath hitched. She froze, her hand hovering over the dog's head. She looked toward the veteran, expecting him to call the animal away, but he remained still, his eyes fixed on the radio components. The veteran said, "He is making a choice. The dog doesn't care about the clothes you wear or the stories you tell. He only cares about the energy you put out into the world. If he trusts you, it's because he sees something in you that I haven't found yet." The bride slowly lowered her hand, her fingers sinking into the thick, coarse fur of the dog's neck. He leaned into her touch, a low vibration of contentment radiating from his chest. The honesty of the moment was overwhelming. She realized that she had brought a lie into a place where the only currency was truth. She looked at the veteran, seeing the scars on his hands and the deep-set wrinkles of his face, and she felt a desperate urge to confess, to tell him that she could walk, that she was Emma Collins, and that her presence here was a breach of his peace. The bride said, I'm not who you think I am. Vincent didn't just leave me. I was testing him. I wanted to see if he loved me or the shadow I cast." The veteran finally looked at her. His grey eyes were like flint, sharp and analytical. He set the radio parts down and leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The veteran said, "Most people are shadows. They live for the reflection they see in others. But in the Amazon, shadows don't last. The sun is too bright, and the dark is too deep. Whatever game you were playing with that man, you brought it to my door. And now, the world you tried to escape is going to come looking for you." He stood up and walked to the porch, signaling the dog to follow. The animal reluctantly lifted his head from the bride's lap, giving her hand one final reassuring nudge before trotting to his master's side. They stood on the porch, looking out at the rising mist that clung to the mahogany trees. The veteran looked at the spot where he had buried the secrets of 1968, the ground still scarred from the drought that had preceded the storm. The veteran said, "Her name was Kate. She used to say that the forest has a way of stripping a person down to their bones. She loved this land because it didn't allow for pretension. She would have seen through you in a heartbeat." The mention of the name hung in the humid air, a heavy and sacred admission. It was the first time the veteran had spoken his wife's name aloud in years, and the weight of the trust it implied was a blade that cut through the bride's defenses. She looked at the man who had saved her, realizing that he had opened his home and his history to a ghost. The bride said, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I didn't mean to bring the noise of my life into your silence." The veteran turned to look at her through the screen door, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the porch. The veteran said, "The noise is already here. I can hear the engines in the distance. The storm has cleared enough for them to find us. Get ready. The time for stories is over." He stepped back into the cabin and reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, his movements becoming sharp and tactical once again. The language of trust had been spoken, but the language of war was about to take its place. The night in the Amazon was never truly silent, but at 3 a.m., it reached a frequency that felt like a physical weight pressing against the cabin's timber walls. The rain had subsided into a haunting, rhythmic dripping, millions of droplets falling from the high mahogany canopy onto the broad, waxy leaves of the undergrowth. Inside, the cabin was a cavern of deep ambers and flickering charcoal shadows, the fire in the hearth having burned down to a pile of glowing orange veins. The veteran lay on his cot near the door, his body motionless, but his mind was a high-resolution sonar, mapping every creak of the floorboards and every shift in the wind. He wasn't sleeping. A man with his history didn't sleep in the presence of an unverified variable. He was breathing with a slow, shallow cadence, his right hand resting inches away from the cold steel of his combat knife, his ears filtering out the natural, chaotic symphony of the jungle to focus on the artificial silence inside the room. For nearly an hour, there was nothing but the steady, heavy respiration of the dog on his rug. Then, a new sound surfaced. A sound that didn't belong to the house settling or the wind through the eaves. It was a sharp, distinct click of a latch, followed by the soft, rhythmic rustle of fabric against fabric. The veteran didn't move a muscle, but his pupils dilated in the dark. He heard the sound of the sofa cushions decompressing, followed by a light, tentative pressure on the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of someone dragging themselves or the mechanical whir of a wheelchair axle. It was the sound of weight being distributed evenly across 2 human feet. The veteran watched through narrowed lids as the silhouette of the bride rose from the shadows of the living area. She didn't reach for her chair. She stood up, her posture straight and effortless, a phantom in the dying firelight. She moved with a fluid, athletic grace that made a mockery of the fragile, broken image she had projected for days. She walked toward the kitchen, her steps light and sure, her feet finding the solid parts of the floor with a precision that suggested she had been practicing this movement in the dark. The veteran felt a cold, sharp blade of ice slide down his spine. It wasn't fear, it was the clinical, absolute realization of a total tactical breach. He had allowed an infiltrator into his sanctum. He had spoken the name of his dead wife to a ghost designed by a corporation. The bride reached the kitchen counter and poured a glass of water. The sound of the liquid hitting the glass, sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. She stood there for a long moment, looking out the dark window toward the jungle, unaware that the shadow by the door had become a predator. The veteran rose from his cot in one fluid, silent motion, his boots making no sound on the wood. He reached for the heavy, tactical flashlight on the table, and with a sharp, mechanical click, he flooded the room with 10,000 lumens of blinding white light. The veteran said, "The miracle of the Amazon. You seem to have found your legs in the middle of the night." The bride froze, the glass slipping from her hand and shattering against the floor, shards of crystal spraying across the mahogany. She turned, her face a mask of caught-out terror, her eyes wide and blinded by the light. She was standing perfectly upright, her hands raised instinctively to shield her eyes. The lie was dead, stripped naked in the glare of the flashlight. The veteran didn't lower the beam. He stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching on the glass, each step a deliberate, rhythmic vibration of judgment. The dog had bolted upright, his hackles a jagged ridge along his spine, his amber eyes darting between the 2 humans, confused by the sudden, violent shift in the room's energy. The bride said, Marcus, please, I can explain. It's not what you think." The veteran said, "I don't care what you think. I care about what I see. I see a woman who sat in my house and watched me build a ramp with my own hands while she knew she didn't need it. I see someone who sat there and let my dog Dietar his head on her lap to comfort a fake pain. You didn't just lie to me. You violated the only thing in this forest that was honest." His voice was a low, guttural rasp, stripped of any warmth. He walked past her to the corner where her high-tech wheelchair sat, the machine he had spent hours repairing. With a sudden, violent shove of his boot, he sent the chair spinning across the room until it crashed into the stone hearth, its wheels spinning uselessly in the air. The violence of the movement made the bride flinch, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The veteran said, "Did Vincent teach you how to do that? To play the victim so well that a man forgets his own training? Or was this your own idea, to see how much a broken soldier would give up for a pretty girl in a chair?" The bride said, "No, Vincent is the reason I did it. I had to be something he couldn't control. I had to see if there was anyone left in the world who would help me without a price tag attached. I didn't know you would be real." The veteran said, "Real. This cabin is real. The mud outside is real. The woman in that photograph was real. You are just noise. You are a billionaire playing a game of dress-up in a graveyard." He turned away from her, his disgust a physical presence in the room. He felt a profound sense of self-loathing for the vulnerability he had shown her on the porch. He had shared the weight of his grief with a woman who was currently evaluating the room for an exit. He walked to the window and looked out at the mist, his hand tightening around the grip of his rifle. The dog moved toward the bride, letting out a low, confused whine, but the veteran's sharp command cut through the air. The veteran said, "Max, heel. Leave her to her own shadows." The dog obeyed instantly, but his ears remained pinned back, his eyes fixed on Emma with a look of animal betrayal that seemed to hurt her more than Marcus's anger. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the veteran's ragged breathing. He realized that the breach was deeper than just a lie. By bringing her here, he had left a digital trail. He knew how corporate security worked. The kind of people Vincent Hale employed didn't lose track of billion-dollar assets. The veteran said, "You have a tracker on you, don't you? A satellite chip. Something they can see from space." The bride looked down at her wrist, at a thin, elegant platinum watch that looked like a piece of jewelry, but hummed with the silent energy of a beacon. She didn't answer, and she didn't have to. From the northern horizon, over the jagged peaks of the distant highlands, a new sound began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the thunder of a storm. It was the high-performance rhythmic thud of a twin-engine turbine. The veteran said, "The Bell 429, they're coming for their property, and they're going to bring the whole world down on this ranch to get it." The sound grew louder, a percussive slap of blades hitting the humid air, shaking the trees and sending the birds into a panicked, screaming flight. The veteran moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency now. He didn't look at Emma as he grabbed his tactical pack and began to prime his perimeter sensors. The time for stories and tea was over. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It was a kill zone. The bride said, "I'll tell them to go away. I'll tell them I'm fine. I'll make them leave you alone." The veteran said, "You don't understand men like Vincent. To him, you are a line item on a ledger. And to him, I am a security flaw that needs to be patched. He won't just leave. He will burn this cabin to make sure I don't talk about what I saw." He walked to the door and kicked it open, the cold mist of the Amazon rushing in to meet the heat of the fire. The lights of the helicopter appeared through the canopy, two blinding white eyes cutting through the darkness like a predator's gaze. The downdraft from the rotors hit the roof with the force of a hurricane, sending the dry ironwood logs in the hearth into a frenzy of sparks. The veteran stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held at a low ready, the dog at his side. He looked at the clearing where the helicopter was beginning its descent, the grass bowing under the artificial wind. The veteran said, "Stay inside. If they see you, they'll think the extraction is green. I want them to think this is a hostile environment." The helicopter landed with a heavy, metallic thud, its landing skids sinking into the red mud Marcus had tried so hard to clear. The side door slid open, and the white light of a search beam illuminated the cabin, turning the dark wood into a stark, skeletal white. A man stepped out, dressed in a navy cashmere coat that looked absurdly clean against the mud. It was Vincent Hale. He didn't look like a man who had been searching for a lost love. He looked like a man who was arriving to inspect a faulty factory. Vincent Hale said, "Emma, stop this ridiculous performance. I know you're in there. I can see your pulse on the monitor. Come out now, and we can still make the gala in Brasilia." He looked at Marcus, his eyes moving from the muddy boots to the scarred face, and finally to the rifle. He smiled, a thin, patronizing expression that held no fear. Vincent Hale said, "And you, the local help. I hope she was worth the trouble. You've cost me 3 days of productivity. I assume a man of your modest means will accept a transfer for the inconvenience, or do I need to have my security team explain the concept of eminent domain to you?" The veteran didn't move. He felt the weight of the technical log in his pack, the one from 1968, and he looked at the man in the expensive coat. He realized that Vincent was just a modern version of the men who had buried his father's truth in the mud. The cycle was repeating, and the Amazon was the only witness left. The veteran said, "The girl stays until I say she goes. And as for your money, Vincent, I've seen better men than you get swallowed by this mud for less than a wristwatch." The dog let out a roar of a bark, a sound that cut through the whine of the turbines, and for the first time, the smile on Vincent's face began to flicker. The battle for the ranch had moved from the shadows into the blinding light of a corporate extraction, and Marcus knew that by the time the sun rose, one of their worlds would be in ashes. Emma stepped out onto the porch, her feet bare, her white dress fluttering in the rotor wash. She stood between the two men, the one who wanted to own her and the one she had betrayed. The dog looked at her, then at Marcus, waiting for the signal that would turn the night into a war. The veteran said, "Make your choice, Emma, but remember, once you step off this porch, the forest stops protecting you." The helicopter's blades continued to spin, a rhythmic, mechanical countdown to a violence that the Amazon had been waiting 60 years to settle. The betrayal was revealed, the lines were drawn, and the silence of the ranch was gone forever. The roar of the Bell 429's twin turbines was a physical assault on the humid Amazonian night, a mechanical scream that tore through the ancient, rhythmic pulse of the rainforest. The downdraft from the rotors acted like a localized hurricane, flattening the high ferns and sending a chaotic vortex of red mud and shredded leaves against the cabin's timber walls. The veteran stood on the porch, his boots planted firmly as if he were part of the foundation itself. He didn't blink as the blinding white searchlight from the helicopter's nose gimbal locked onto him, turning his weathered face into a mask of high-contrast shadows and sharp, silver edges. Beside him, the dog was a coiled spring of charcoal and silver fur, his lips pulled back in a silent, vibrating snarl that was felt more than heard over the engine's whine. The veteran said, "Shut down the engines, Vincent. You are wasting fuel, and you are vibrating my house off its pilings." Vincent Hale stood in the center of the muddy clearing, his navy cashmere coat already stained by the flying debris. He looked like a man who had stepped out of a boardroom and into a nightmare he intended to buy his way out of. Behind him, 2 men in sterile gray tactical gear stepped out of the helicopter. They weren't soldiers. They were private security contractors, men who traded in the logistics of force and the sanitation of inconvenient truths. They held short-barreled submachine guns at a low ready, their eyes obscured by night vision goggles that glowed with a sickly green luminescence. Vincent Hale said, "I don't think you understand the power dynamics here, Ranger. I am not a guest, and this is not a social call. You have something that belongs to the Collins Group. You have held a high-value asset against her will for 3 days. In most jurisdictions, that is called kidnapping. In the Amazon, it's called a disappearance." The veteran shifted his grip on his rifle, his movements so small and precise they were almost invisible to the men in the clearing. He knew these types of contractors. They relied on their gear, their sensors, their thermal overlays, and their superior firepower. But they didn't know the mud. They didn't know the way the moisture in the Amazon could foul a high-end optic, or how the dense canopy could swallow a radio signal in seconds. The veteran said, "She walked into this forest on her own, and she's standing on my porch under her own power. If you want to talk about kidnapping, talk to the man who left a woman in a broken wheelchair to drown in a rising river." Emma stepped forward, her bare feet pressing into the damp wood of the porch. The white lace of her wedding dress was a tattered, muddy flag in the wind of the rotors. She looked at Vincent, and for the first time in years, she didn't see a partner or a protector. She saw a predator whose only interest was the preservation of his own ego and the assets he controlled. Emma said, "Go home, Vincent. I am not going back with you. Not to the gala, not to the company, and certainly not to the cage you built for me." Vincent Hale laughed, a sharp, cold sound that was nearly lost in the mechanical roar. He stepped closer, the mud sucking at his expensive leather shoes. He ignored the veteran entirely, focusing his predatory gaze on Emma. Vincent Hale said, "Emma, don't be tedious. The board is already asking questions about your absence. The stock price of Collins Group is sensitive to your eccentricities. This little rebellion in the mud has cost us millions. You are coming back to Brasilia tonight, even if I have to have these gentlemen sedate you for the flight." The veteran said, "The first man who moves toward this porch is going to find out why the local tribes call this place the grave of the earth. I don't care about your stock price, Vincent. I care about the rules of my house." One of the security contractors, a man with a thick neck and a vacant professional stare, made the mistake of shifting his weight. He began to raise his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger guard. The veteran didn't wait for the escalation. He didn't fire his rifle. Instead, he reached for a small remote detonator in his vest pocket and pressed a single button. A series of high-intensity, non-lethal flashbangs, positioned weeks ago as part of his perimeter defense, erupted in a synchronized sequence around the clearing. There was no boom in the narrative, only the description of a violent, white-hot expansion of light and a wall of concussive pressure that slammed into the helicopter and the men standing beside it. The light was so bright it burned through the sensors of the contractor's night vision goggles, sending them into a state of temporary, agonizing blindness. The veteran said, "Max, neutralize." The dog didn't need a second command. He was off the porch before the light had even faded, a silver blur of predatory efficiency. He didn't go for the throats. He went for the lead contractor's primary weapon arm. The man screamed as 60 kilograms of muscle and jaw clamped onto his forearm, the force of the impact sending him spiraling into the deep red mud. The second contractor tried to clear his blurred vision, but the veteran was already off the porch, moving with a speed that defied his age. He didn't use his rifle as a firearm. He used it as a blunt force instrument, swinging the butt of the weapon into the man's solar plexus with a sickening thud. The contractor went down, gasping for air that the humid jungle refused to provide. The veteran stood over him for a second, his shadow looming large in the helicopter's spotlight, before turning his gaze to Vincent Hale. The billionaire had retreated toward the open door of the Bell 429, his face pale, his composure shattered by the sudden, violent asymmetry of the fight. The veteran said, "Your toys don't work here, Vincent. The Amazon doesn't recognize your bank account." Emma walked down the steps, her bare feet sinking into the mud. She didn't look at the fallen men or the snarling dog, who was still pinning the lead contractor to the earth. She walked straight to Vincent, her eyes cold and filled with an absolute terrifying clarity. Emma said, "You wanted to see if I was worth the trouble of a rescue? You got your answer. You're not here for me. You're here for the optics. You're here because you're afraid of what I'll say when I'm finally out from under your thumb." Vincent Hale said, "You're insane. You're standing in the mud with a broken soldier and a wild animal. You have nothing without me, Emma. No home, no status, no future." Emma said, "I have the truth, and I have the logs from 1968 that Marcus found. If you don't get in that helicopter and leave this ranch right now, I will make sure every news agency from New York to London receives a digital copy of what the Collins Group buried in this forest 60 years ago." The threat was a physical blow. Vincent looked at the veteran, then at the dog, and finally at the woman who had once been his most valuable asset. He realized that he wasn't just losing a wife. He was facing an existential threat to the empire he had spent his life protecting. The veteran whistled once, and the dog released the contractor, stepping back, but remaining in a low, predatory crouch, his eyes never leaving the man's throat. The veteran said, "Get your men in the air, Vincent. The next time I see that light in my trees, I won't be using non-lethal deterrents. And tell Ethelred Solutions that the Amazon is closed for business." Vincent Hale didn't say another word. He scrambled back into the helicopter, his navy coat caked in the red earth he so despised. The two contractors, bruised and humiliated, followed him, dragging their expensive, fouled weapons behind them. The side door slid shut with a heavy metallic slam, and the turbines began to whine with a renewed, desperate intensity. The helicopter lifted off, its searchlight sweeping across the cabin one last time, before it banked sharply to the north, disappearing into the mist and the dark. The silence that rushed back into the clearing was deafening, a heavy, humid weight that felt more oppressive than the engine's roar. The wind died down, and the only sound was the rhythmic dripping of the trees and the heavy, ragged breathing of the veteran. The veteran didn't look at Emma. He walked back to the porch and sat on the top step, his rifle resting across his knees. He looked at the mud, at the deep ruts the helicopter had left in his land, and he felt a profound, aching weariness. He had saved the ranch, and he had saved the girl, but the peace he had spent years building was gone. The world had found him, and it wouldn't forget the way to his door. Emma walked to the edge of the porch, standing a few feet away from him. The dog moved between them, looking from one to the other, his tail giving a single, hesitant wag before he settled onto the wood, his head resting on his paws. Emma said, "You saved me again, even after you knew I lied, even after I broke your trust." The veteran said, "I didn't do it for you. I did it because those men think they can own the forest. They think everything has a price. I had to remind them that some things stay in the dark for a reason." He finally looked at her, his grey eyes cold and unyielding. The veteran said, "The storm is over, Emma. Grace Mitchell will be here in the morning with a vehicle. You're going to get in it, and you're going to take your noise and your secrets back to your own world. I want my silence back." Emma looked at the man who had given her everything and asked for nothing, and she realized that the debt she owed him was something money could never touch. She looked at the dog, whose amber eyes were filled with a lingering animal sadness, and she felt the true weight of her betrayal. She hadn't just lied about her legs. She had corrupted the only honest thing left in the Amazon. Emma said, "I'll leave, but I won't forget what you did, and I won't let them take this from you." The veteran didn't answer. He stared into the black heart of the rainforest, waiting for the sun to rise over the red mud, knowing that in the Amazon, the only thing more dangerous than a storm was the quiet that followed it. The siege was over, but the war for the truth of 1968 was just beginning. The dawn over the Amazonian basin did not arrive with a celebratory burst of light, but with a slow, agonizing transition from the bruised purple of the storm to a heavy, suffocating grey. The rainforest began to steam, a dense white mist rising from the saturated floor and curling around the trunks of the mahogany trees like the breath of a ghost. The veteran stood on the edge of his porch, his boots caked in the red slurry of the night's battle. He watched the first pale rays of the sun struggle to penetrate the canopy, turning the hanging vines into skeletal silhouettes. The silence that had returned to the ranch was hollow, a jagged void left behind by the departure of the helicopter. The veteran said, "The world knows where we are now. The silence is broken, and it won't be easily mended." Behind him, the interior of the cabin felt like an abandoned bunker. The smell of tea and wood smoke had been replaced by the metallic tang of ozone and the sharp, chemical scent of hydraulic fluid from the helicopter's downdraft. The dog was lying on his rug near the hearth, his head resting on his paws. He wasn't sleeping. His eyes were fixed on the empty sofa where the woman in the white dress had spent 3 nights. The dog let out a low, mournful whine, a sound of profound animal confusion. He had defended her, he had trusted her, and now he was left with the lingering scent of a betrayal he couldn't fully comprehend. The veteran said, "She is gone, partner. Back to the noise and the concrete. We are exactly where we started." At 9 a.m., a battered 4x4 with the markings of the Regional Health Service rattled up the access road, its engine struggling against the deep ruts. Grace Mitchell was at the wheel, her face pale and drawn. She didn't ask about the helicopter or the scorched grass in the clearing. She had lived in the Amazon long enough to know when a man's silence was a warning. Emma stepped out of the cabin, wearing the same faded flannel shirt and sturdy boots the veteran had given her. She didn't look like a billionaire anymore. She looked like someone who had been stripped down to her core by the forest. Emma said, "I left a letter on the table. It's not an apology. You don't want those. It's just the truth." The veteran didn't look at her as she climbed into Grace's vehicle. He didn't say goodbye, and he didn't offer a final word of advice. He simply stood there until the sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving him alone with the dog and the weight of his own history. He walked back inside and found the letter. It was written on a scrap of technical paper, the handwriting precise but hurried. She wrote about the cage of her life, the transitional nature of her world, and the shocking, silent honesty of his. She wrote about the dog, calling him the only creature who had ever seen her without looking for a price tag. The veteran said, "She thinks words can patch a hole in the hull. She still thinks like a person with a bank account." He folded the letter and placed it in the small iron box where he kept his father's things from 1968. He locked it and threw the key into the back of a drawer. For 3 weeks, the veteran returned to his Spartan routine. He repaired the fence, he cleared the debris from the storm, and he hunted for food in the deep brush. But something had changed. The silence of the ranch, which had once been his comfort, now felt like a prison. The dog was different too. He was no longer the focused, tactical shadow he had once been. He would sit by the porch for hours, his amber eyes fixed on the road, waiting for a vehicle that never came. One afternoon, as the Amazonian heat reached its peak, a small mailboat arrived at the river landing. The operator handed the veteran a single, thick envelope with the official seal of the Regional Bank of Brazil. The veteran felt a familiar, cold dread in his stomach. He was months behind on his payments, and the drought before the storm had decimated his small harvest. He knew what was coming, the final notice, the end of his legacy. He sat on the porch and ripped the envelope open, his jaw set for the bad news. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery. It wasn't a foreclosure notice. It was a statement of account. At the bottom, in bold black ink, were the words, "Balance 0. Mortgage paid in full." The payer was listed as Collins Group Holdings. The veteran said, "She bought the debt. She turned my home into a charity project." His first instinct was rage. He wanted to find a phone, to call the bank, to tell them he didn't accept the money of a liar. He wanted to scream at the jungle for allowing his pride to be auctioned off. But as he looked at the document, he saw the date of the payment. It had been processed the same day she left. This wasn't a bribe to keep him quiet about the secrets of 1968. It was a tactical extraction. She had seen the one thing that was truly trapping him. Not the mud, but the debt. And she had neutralized it with the only weapon she had. The veteran said, "She didn't pay the debt for me. She did it to protect the land. She did it for the dog." He looked at the dog, who was suddenly alert, his ears pinned forward. A sound was echoing through the trees, the low, struggling grind of an old engine. A blue, rusted Ford pickup truck emerged from the tree line, moving slowly through the mud. It wasn't a corporate vehicle. It was a work truck, bought from a local market. It stopped in the clearing, and Emma stepped out. She wasn't wearing lace or flannel. She was dressed in jeans, a simple t-shirt, and work boots. She looked tired, but for the first time, her eyes were clear. She didn't walk toward the porch. She stood by her truck and reached into the cab, pulling out a large, heavy object. It was a bright red rubber ball, the kind designed for high-drive working dogs, nearly indestructible. She held it up so the dog could see it. The dog didn't wait for a command. He exploded off the porch, a silver blur of pure, uncomplicated joy. He didn't bark. He let out a sound of absolute relief as he reached her, his tail a frantic blur. He took the ball from her hand, his head shaking with excitement, before dropping it at her feet and looking back at the veteran. Emma said, "I didn't come back as a billionaire. I came back as a person who needs to learn how to live in the silence. I'm staying at Grace's place. I'm helping her rebuild the river cabin." The veteran stood up, his hand resting on the porch railing. He looked at the woman who had paid his debts, and the dog who had already forgiven her. He realized that the war for the truth of 1968 wasn't over, but for the first time in 4 years, he wasn't fighting it alone. He looked at the red mud, then at the bright red ball in the dog's mouth. The veteran said, "The ball is too bright for the forest. It makes you a target." Emma smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes. Emma said, "Then I guess we'll just have to be fast enough to stay ahead of the target." The veteran nodded slowly. He didn't offer her a seat, and he didn't invite her inside. But he didn't tell her to leave. He walked down the steps and picked up the red ball, throwing it deep into the ferns. The dog vanished into the greenery, his silver coat flashing in the sunlight. The veteran looked at Emma, and the silence between them was no longer a weapon. It was a beginning. The veteran said, "Come on, partner. Let's see if she knows how to handle the heat." They walked into the forest together, the veteran, the dog, and the woman who had found her soul in the mud. The Amazon watched them, a vast green witness to a debt that was finally, truly settled.